Hey friends, I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
The late afternoon light stretched across the balcony, softened by the faint haze that lingered in the air and dulled the sharp edges of the city skyline. In the distance, the fading sun washed the buildings in muted tones of amber and gray, its rays slipping through the railings and casting long, parallel shadows that cut across the tiled floor beneath their feet. The faint hum of the street below drifted upward in fragments, carried on slow currents of air that shifted now and then with the occasional passing of a car. The sound softened by distance until it felt more like a pulse than a noise. The metal frame of the balcony railing held a trace of residual warmth from the earlier hours of sunlight, its surface radiating a subtle heat into the cooling air, while the faint smell of concrete and distant greenery hung lightly, mingling with the dry scent of the tiles beneath them. A small table sat near the corner, untouched save for the glass of water resting on its edge, the condensation clinging to the clear surface, catching the fading light and scattering it into thin, trembling lines along the tabletop. The air was neither still nor restless, the faintest breeze brushing against the curtains behind the open doorway to the apartment, sending the fabric outward in soft, irregular arcs that subsided as quickly as they came, their movement stirring the scent of the cooled interior air into the warmer tones of the balconies. Fading day. He stood near the railing, his hands resting lightly along its edge, fingers tracing absent, slow paths along the cool metal as his gaze wandered across the blurred distance where the sun hung low, its light dipping closer toward the horizon. The faint sounds of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, and the muted rumble of a train far off formed a layered chorus that swelled and ebbed beneath the stillness of their elevated space, none of it sharp enough to intrude, only folding into the atmosphere like a constant, subdued hum. The shadows on the balcony lengthened with each passing minute, stretching from the edge of the table to the threshold where the doorway stood, the thin lines between light and dark softening as the sun descended, the glow fading to deeper, richer tones that made every reflection on the metal railing and the glass of water seem sharper. Against the muted backdrop, the curtain behind them swayed again, brushing gently against the frame as another soft gust passed through, and for a moment, the faint sound of the apartment's interior clock ticked through the open door, its measured rhythm mingling with the outside sounds before fading back into the quieter layer of the room beyond. His posture shifted slightly, his weight transferring from one foot to the other as his fingers released the railing for a brief moment before finding it again, the faint scrape of skin against metal producing a sound so quiet it dissolved almost instantly into the air around them. The sky deepened, streaks of pale orange giving way to shades of dusky lavender, the first thin glimmers of evening settling at the edges of the horizon, while the streetlights below flickered one by one, their soft hum joining the city's distant chorus. The warm metal beneath his fingertips cooled slowly as the sun's reach withdrew, the change subtle yet tangible, the temperature drop brushing faintly against his skin while the surrounding air carried a new, gentler chill. The distant noise of a lone scooter passing through the narrow streets below momentarily rose above the other sounds, its high, thin whine fading as quickly as it had surfaced, leaving behind the persistent hum of traffic and the quiet rustle of leaves stirred by the shifting breeze. The glass of water on the table reflected a thin, quivering band of the streetlight's glow as the natural light dimmed further, the faint ripple on its surface a response to the gentle movement of air that traced through the space and stirred the condensation clinging to the rim. The curtain moved once more, slower this time, its fabric catching on the edge of the doorway before falling back into place, the subtle motion barely noticeable against the deepening hues of the evening. The weight of the moment settled heavier with the light's retreat, every soft sound, The shifting air, the hums, the distant movements below, pulling into sharper focus as the balcony seemed to drift further from the rest of the city. Suspended in the muted glow and stillness of the approaching dusk, he remained by the railing, his fingers still tracing along the cooling surface, his breath steady but deeper now, each inhalation slow, each exhalation quieter, his frame a still shape against the backdrop of a day fading into the calm edge of night. His hands remained on the railing for a moment longer, fingertips grazing the metal as if feeling the gradual cooling of the surface. The faint residue of the sun's warmth fading beneath the touch until it felt smooth and indifferent. Holding only the chill of the descending evening air, he straightened slightly, drawing in a measured breath that expanded his chest, the sound of it almost inaudible yet distinct in the layered quiet that surrounded the balcony. The inhale was slow, steady, carrying with it the faint scent of distant rain from somewhere far across the city mixed with the lingering traces of heated stone and asphalt rising from the streets below. A blend of the day's remnants and the onset of night. The air filled his lungs with a subtle heaviness, the coolness settling deep before he let it leave in a long, deliberate exhale, his shoulders lowering as he released the tension held there, the quiet stream of breath dissipating into the faint breeze that moved through the open space. The distant hum of traffic beneath him ebbed as he stood motionless, his ears catching the sporadic rise of sharper sounds. The occasional distant horn, the faint hiss of tires against the road as a single car passed through the side streets. Each sound stretching and fading as if the wind itself softened them before they could fully reach his elevated position. The curtain behind him swayed inward again, brushing against the doorframe with a muted whisper, the motion pulling a pocket of cooler air from the dim apartment interior toward the balcony, mingling it with the outside air in a subtle shift that curled faintly around his ankles. His fingers tightened around the railing briefly as another breath filled his chest, this one deeper, drawing in the muted scent of faintly blooming greenery from somewhere far below. A barely detectable undertone carried upward through the shifting air, threading between the sharper, drier scents of concrete and distant smoke from a nearby chimney. His gaze lowered toward the street for a moment, his eyes following the slow glow of a bus as it moved along the avenue several blocks away. The distant rumble of its engine, a low, drawn-out sound that merged with the layered hum of the city's constant motion. Muted but unbroken, the light from the sky dimmed further as the sun continued its descent, the last pale streaks of lavender giving way to deeper blues and grays. The faint glint of the first evening lights in the windows of faraway buildings beginning to flicker into view like scattered fragments of warmth against the cool horizon. His breathing settled into a rhythm with the quiet noise around him, the steady rise and fall of his chest aligning almost unconsciously with the faint clicking of the ceiling fan inside the apartment, the sound barely reaching the balcony through the open doorway yet persistent enough to blend with the subtler sounds outside. The condensation on the glass of water by the table began to bead into larger drops as the air cooled, small trails forming and sliding down to pool at the base, the faint glimmer of the streetlight reflecting in each droplet as they traced their way downward, in slow, uneven paths. His hand released the railing for a moment as he shifted his stance, his palm brushing lightly against the cool surface of the tiled floor to steady himself as he leaned forward slightly, drawing in another breath that carried more of the evening's chill, the crispness of it mixing with the distant aromas of rain, smoke, and faint urban greenery that clung subtly to the wind. The sound of a bird taking off from a rooftop nearby cut briefly through the layered hums, its wings flapping sharply before fading into the distance, leaving behind only the soft rustle of the leaves stirred by a passing gust and the ever-present undertone of the city's subdued life far below. His gaze rose again toward the fading horizon, the sun now a faint ember behind the line of low clouds. Its glow dulled and dispersed into a thin halo that barely reached the tops of the surrounding buildings. The breath he drew in next came slower still, deeper, as though the air itself had thickened with the advancing dusk. And when he exhaled, the sound was so faint it was almost consumed entirely by the distant rustle of leaves and the muted rattle of a loose gutter somewhere on a building nearby. The cooling air traced along his jaw and the exposed skin of his arms, leaving a faint prickling in its wake as his posture steadied. His shoulders squared slightly, each slow breath drawn with a deliberateness that filled the quiet space with a presence that felt heavier than the fading light. A moment suspended between the sounds of a city settling into evening and the stillness that had begun to creep over the balcony with the coming night. She shifted her weight slowly, her body turning away from the railing and the open stretch of skyline beyond. Her movements unhurried but deliberate. The faint scrape of her shoes against the tiled floor the only sound she made as the air around her carried the soft hum of the distant city. Her arms remained at her sides, fingers curling and uncurling in slight, involuntary motions as her eyes moved from the fading light outside to the dim glow spilling from the apartment behind the glass doors. The muted warmth inside contrasting with the cooling tones of the evening that lingered over the balcony. The curtain stirred faintly in the shifting air, brushing against her arm as she pivoted her stance. The fabric cool and weightless as it traced along her sleeve before falling still again, its movement leaving only the faintest whisper behind, a sound that faded almost instantly into the layered quiet. The table near the corner of the balcony stood untouched, the condensation on the glass of water still trailing in uneven lines toward the base, each droplet reflecting the thin, fractured glow of the street lamp below. A tremor passing through the rippling surface as another breeze rolled in and moved through the open space. Her gaze lingered on the faint reflection of the apartment's interior light on the surface of the water, the warm tone bending and shifting as the ripples spread outward and stilled. A fragile image that vanished each time the curtain caught a new current of air and disturbed the shadows crawling along the tiles. The hum of the ceiling fan inside the apartment continued its steady rotation, its muted clicking faintly audible through the open doorway, blending with the softened chorus of sounds beyond the balcony. The distant rise and fall of car engines, the occasional horn softened by the space between their height and the streets below. Her breathing came slower now, each inhale subtle and measured, the faint movement of her shoulders marking the rhythm of the air she drew in, its coolness brushing against the exposed skin at her neckline before dissipating as she exhaled. The sound barely perceptible beneath the deeper tones of the city's background. The horizon, no longer streaked with lavender or pale amber, had given way entirely to shades of muted blue and charcoal, the last traces of sunlight slipping behind the clustered silhouettes of the buildings, leaving only the fractured glow of scattered street lamps and distant windows to cast warmth into the advancing dusk. She tilted her head slightly toward the street below, her eyes following the movement of a single pair of headlights drifting slowly along the road. The faint hiss of wet tires against the pavement reaching upward, stretched and softened by the layers of air between, fading before the vehicle disappeared into the curve of the avenue. Her hands stilled at her sides as she turned her gaze back toward the balcony's edge, her posture remaining steady though the faint rise of her breath seemed sharper now, the rhythm deepening as another gust of wind moved across the open space and caused the curtain behind her to billow outward once again, the fabric folding against her shoulder before retreating. The shadows on the tiles shifted with the movement, the parallel lines cast by the railing bending and trembling as the street lamp's glow beyond flickered slightly, its light interrupted by the swaying branches of the tree below, their shapes stretching and crawling across the floor before retreating into the darker corners as The wind died down again. The sound of the distant train far across the city rose briefly. Its low, resonant rumble cutting through the softer noises before blending back into the layered hum. The vibration almost imperceptible beneath her feet. A faint pulse that seemed to echo through the structure itself before fading entirely. Her eyes lowered to the floor for a moment, tracing the lines of light and shadow that crept slowly along the tiles as the wind shifted again. The faint reflection of the interior light from behind her elongating and distorting across the smooth surface before dissolving as the curtain settled back into its still position. Her movements grew minimal, almost imperceptible now, as she drew in another breath that carried the subtle dampness of the evening air. The faint trace of rain and earth threading between the lingering scent of stone and distant smoke. Her chest rising and falling with a deliberateness that matched the slowing cadence of the night. Around her, the balcony, suspended between the muted glow of the interior and the deepening hues of the outside world, held its quiet tension. Every sound, the hums, the breezes, the distant noises, woven into a single, subdued atmosphere as she stood with her back partially turned, her figure anchored against the shifting shadows and cooling air, unmoving except for the faint, deliberate rhythm of her breath. The air along the balcony thickened with a weight that came not from noise but from the absence of it, the soft hum of the city below growing distant as though muffled by the cooling twilight, while the muted light from the apartment behind cast a thin glow that barely reached the edge of the tiled floor. His posture shifted subtly, his shoulders lifting and settling again as if a motion begun but left unfinished. His hands loosening at his sides before returning once more to rest lightly against the railing. Fingers grazing the cool metal with an absent, repetitive motion. The faint sound of his breathing mingled with the layered whispers of the environment. The soft brushing of the curtain against the doorway. The rhythmic turning of the ceiling fan within the apartment. The distant hum of traffic stretching through the lower streets. Each sound folding into the other and forming a quiet undercurrent that gave the impression of life. While feeling almost static, his lips parted slightly, a breath caught at the threshold of forming words that never fully emerged. The sound that escaped too shallow to break the stillness, absorbed almost instantly by the weight of the space that surrounded them. Her back remained partially turned, the angle of her shoulders set as if carved from the same fading light that reached across the balcony, her figure unmoving except for the faint, involuntary sway of her hair each time the wind stirred and sent another ripple through the curtain, its fabric catching the air and pulling it into the hollow space between the indoors and out. The glass of water on the table quivered faintly as a new gust slid across the balcony, the surface rippling in concentric waves that distorted the soft reflection of the street lamp's glow, breaking the image into fragmented shapes before it stilled again. The droplets of condensation sliding down the sides gathering into a thin pool along the rim of the base. His gaze lingered on her back, tracing the immobile line of her frame against the dim glow spilling through the doorway. The warm tones of the apartment inside bleeding outward but failing to soften the cool, dim palette of the encroaching evening. The distant call of a siren rose faintly from somewhere far beyond the narrow streets below, its pitch bending and fading as it moved away, swallowed by the layered hum of the city's quieter nighttime chorus. Its brief presence no more than a ripple against the nearly unbroken tone of the atmosphere around them. His chest expanded with another slow breath, the rise of his shoulders more deliberate this time, the exhale drawn longer as though he hoped to anchor himself in the sound of his own breathing. But it, too, disappeared almost immediately into the ambient noises, leaving no trace of intent behind. The shadows cast by the railing stretched further along the tiles as the last remnants of natural light vanished from the horizon, the glow of the street lamp beyond strengthening by contrast and throwing sharp, pale lines across the floor that shifted gently whenever the branches of the tree below swayed and interrupted the steady illumination. Her gaze dropped toward the floor without fully turning, her eyes following the trembling paths of those shadows as they crawled toward the far edge of the balcony, bending and unraveling with each subtle gust of wind, their movements an unspoken reflection of the disjointed tension that had taken hold of the space. The ticking of a clock from inside the apartment reached them more clearly for a moment as the wind stilled, each measured beat cutting through the quiet like a reminder of something inevitable, only to recede back into the mechanical hum of the fan and the distant, subdued sounds of the streets below. When the draft returned, his jaw tightened briefly, a faint motion of muscle beneath the dim light as another breath began to build, his lips parting again as if to shape words. But the sound never gained strength, the fragment swallowed by the hollow air and left to vanish against the quiet backdrop. Her shoulders drew the faintest rise as the wind shifted and pulled the curtain outward once more, its edge brushing her side before retreating. The sound of the fabric dragging softly across the doorway lingering longer than any sound between them. The table's glass of water stilled once more, its reflection of the street lamp's fractured light forming a single, unbroken band as the ripples smoothed, the condensation tracing its final paths downward before merging with the thin pool beneath. The faint sound of droplets gathering barely audible but present against the layered hush. The balcony, poised between the interior glow and the muted blue-gray of the descending night, held the tension of a conversation unspoken. Each small sound, the wind, the hums, the shifting of fabric, the measured breaths, magnified by the absence of words, until every detail pressed into the stillness with a weight that lingered, unmoving, as neither of them allowed the air to change with speech. The silence on the balcony deepened as the last fragments of daylight disappeared entirely, leaving only the muted amber glow of the street lamp below and the faint, diluted warmth spilling from the open doorway of the apartment to shape the edges of the space. The hum of the ceiling fan inside continued its slow, steady rotation, the faint clicking of its mechanism reaching faintly through the doorway, a sound that mingled with the soft rustle of the curtain as it swayed in and out with the occasional gust of wind that wound its way upward from the narrow streets below. The glass of water on the table had gone still, its surface flat and dark except where the reflections of the street lamp fractured along its rim, trembling faintly with each subtle shift in the air, a fragile thread of brightness against the surrounding dimness. His breathing slowed, the rhythm of it deep and measured, each inhale drawing the cool scent of the evening into his chest, tinged with traces of rain-soaked stone and the faint metallic tang of the city below. Each exhale leaving his lungs without force, dissolving into the broader hush that filled the night around them. Her frame near the doorway remained anchored, her posture unmoving despite the way the wind lifted strands of her hair and sent them drifting briefly across her cheek before laying them back against her shoulder, the strands catching the faint light from the apartment before fading into shadow again. The ticking of the clock within grew clearer for a moment, the space between each beat stretching as if time itself slowed, the sound cutting through the layered tones of wind and distant traffic before it receded again, muted by the next roll of air that carried the muffled sounds of the city's quieter life. An occasional car turning along a side street, the faint rattle of a loose sign in the distance, the low, indistinct murmur of voices carried from somewhere far below. The balcony railing cooled further under the touch of the air, the temperature of the metal dropping to a chill that seemed to seep into the space itself. The parallel shadows it cast across the tiled floor now sharp and rigid, the lines trembling each time the branches of the tree below swayed in front of the streetlight and broke the steady glow into fractured shapes. His hands, no longer resting on the railing, hovered near his sides as though uncertain of where to settle, fingers curling slightly in quiet, restless movements that matched the faint tightening along his jaw, the subtle motions standing out in contrast to the otherwise stillness of his stance. Her breathing deepened, though softer than his, each inhale drawn in a rhythm that rose and fell in near silence. Her chest expanding beneath the soft folds of her clothing as she stood angled toward the interior light, the warm glow casting a faint halo along one side of her figure while the rest remained in the cooler tones of the evening. A loose shutter on a neighboring balcony shifted with the breeze, its faint creak traveling across the empty space between buildings before fading into the lower hums. A sound so slight it seemed to vanish before it fully reached them, leaving only the layered murmurs of the environment. Wind, distant engines, faint ticking. Behind, the curtain swept outward again, this time broader as a stronger gust passed through, the fabric lifting in a smooth arc before falling back, brushing along the side of her arm with a soft, weightless touch, its folds casting momentary shadows across the floor that slid and stretched before dissolving when it stilled once more. The reflection of the streetlight's fractured glow trembled again along the surface of the water, the faint ripples breaking the band of light into smaller, scattered fragments before smoothing into a single, still line. The condensation now gathered at the base, pooling silently, its small, steady drips inaudible over the layered hum that surrounded them. The stillness between them thickened, each mechanical sound, each subtle motion of air or fabric amplifying the absence of speech. Every second stretched and measured by the clock's steady rhythm as if the space itself was marking the silence that neither of them broke. The branches outside shifted once more, their shadows sliding in thin, spindly patterns across the tiles as the street lamp beyond flickered faintly with the motion, the trembling light casting the balcony in a shifting, uneven glow that made each surface and outline momentarily seem softer before the steadier glow returned. Their breaths, alternating but never aligned, became the only consistent motion in the moment, a quiet rhythm layered against the backdrop of wind and distant life. The presence of each inhale and exhale somehow louder for the lack of anything else filling the air. Between them, the evening continued to press down on the balcony with a density that felt tangible. The tension of unspoken words suspended in the soft glow of the lights and the layered sounds of the city, every passing moment knitting itself tighter into the silence until it seemed impossible for anything but the hush itself to occupy the space they shared. He turned slowly from the railing, the faint scrape of his shoes against the cool tiles the only sound he made as his figure shifted away from the muted glow of the street lamp beyond, his shadow stretching across the floor before folding into the darker corners near the doorway. The curtain stirred again as another gust of wind wound its way upward, the fabric lifting and curling inward, brushing lightly along his sleeve as it swayed, the faint touch leaving only a whisper of sound before it settled back against the frame, its folds trembling for a moment longer before stilling. His breathing deepened, each inhale carrying the crispness of the night air tinged with the faint trace of rain and stone rising from the streets below, each exhale softer, vanishing into the layered hush that lingered around the balcony and drifted through the dim light spilling from the apartment interior. The glow from the room inside pooled faintly across the threshold, its warmth stopping just short of where he stood as he glanced briefly toward the doorway, the muted amber light outlining the edges of the furniture within and casting elongated, soft-edged shadows across the wooden floor inside. The sound of the ceiling fan's steady clicking reached him more distinctly now as he moved toward the door, the mechanical rhythm blending with the steady ticking of the clock on the far wall, their paired cadence marking the passage of time in the same subdued tones that had underscored every moment of the fading evening. Her frame near the doorway remained unmoving, the line of her shoulders fixed as the glow from the apartment brushed along one side of her figure. The rest of her shape dissolving into the cooler tones of the encroaching night. Her hair shifted slightly as another breeze moved through, the strands catching the faint interior light before settling back against her. The soft movement so slight it seemed to dissolve into the dimness before it could truly be seen. The faintest creak came from the hinge of the balcony door as he reached for it, his fingers brushing the cool edge of the handle, the metallic surface carrying the same chill as the railing had, the temperature a small but palpable contrast against the lingering warmth of his skin. The low murmur of the city below, softened by height and distance, drifted upward as he drew a slow breath, his chest rising once more as he let his eyes rest briefly on the shifting shadows cast by the branches swaying beneath the street lamp, their long shapes crawling across the edge of the balcony tiles before breaking apart when the wind paused. The curtain moved again as he pulled the door open further, the fabric drawn inward by the motion and folding in on itself before settling back with a faint, weightless sound. The rush of slightly warmer air from inside brushing against the cooler night and mingling into a single, muted current that curled around his legs and traced faintly along the floor. His steps carried him across the threshold with a slow deliberateness, the faint thud of his soles on the wooden floor inside muffled by the ambient hum of the apartment. His figure slipping gradually from the cooler hues of the balcony into the muted amber tones of the interior until the glow fully enveloped him. The faint click of the latch followed as he eased the balcony door closed behind him. The sound soft but distinct as the glass pane sealed out the sharper chill and the distant sounds of the streets below, leaving only the subdued warmth of the room's atmosphere, the gentle whirl of the fan above, and the steady rhythm of the clocks ticking to fill the space. The curtain stilled at last against the frame, its edges brushing lightly against the glass as the last faint draft faded. The balcony beyond now silent save for the softened glow of the street lamp casting its pale, fractured light across the empty tiles, the parallel lines of the railing's shadow stretching long across the floor. Undisturbed by motion, she remained near the doorway, her eyes unfocused as they lingered on the faint reflection of the street lamp through the glass, her breath rising and falling in the same steady cadence it had kept throughout. The room around her quiet save for the layered hum of its mechanisms and the faint rustle of air as the fan turned above. His footsteps, soft and deliberate, carried him further into the apartment, the muted sound of his movement swallowed gradually by the heavier air inside, leaving the threshold between the two spaces in stillness. The balcony untouched now but for the shifting shadows outside and the faint glimmer of condensation still sliding down the side of the glass of water resting on the table. The apartment's glow, though warm, did not reach far beyond its frame, and the exterior remained suspended in its cool palette of deep blues and grays. The hum of the distant streets a faint undertone beneath the hush. The entire space, inside and out, settling into a quiet so complete that every mechanical sound, every whisper of fabric, every creak of wood felt amplified, filling the absence left by his departure as the night continued to deepen.
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.